Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ernst Kantorowicz. I'm a professor here at UCLA in the Department of Comparative Literature and also in the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies. And it is really a great pleasure to welcome so many of you to today's lecture in the UCLA Experimental Critical Theory program that was funded in 2008. And the ECT, as we call it, is housed in the Department of Comparative Literature, but it is also generously supported by the Dean of the Humanities, the Dean of the Social Sciences, the UCHRI, the UC Humanities Research Institute, and our donors. That's all right, please welcome. This year's ECT seminar on ternary positionality, relationality, decoloniality, and interpretation attempts to undo binaries through ternary thinking. Instead of disrupting or subverting the binary with a new oppositional pair and thus recreating the dialectical gesture, instead of proposing the hybrid or the creole, we attempt to think from an autonomous and relational third space. The intermediary is an example of ternary relationality, not an in-between or a go-between, not a broker or a translator, not a gray area, a middle ground, or a transitional space, neither neutral nor silent, but an agent in their own right. Specifically, the seminar focuses on the hard binary opposition between Western epistemology and the colonial epistemic disobedience through the politics of refusal, on relationality as a ternary structure, on intra-action as a ternary positionality, and comparison and translation as ternary processes. To wit, how does interpreting from ternary positionality change the stock image of the oppositional and or ungendered historical figure of the marginalized, the slave, the Indian? How does it intervene in the debates of resistance versus refusal or debates of liberty versus freedom? How does it interrogate notions of historiography of early colonial encounters in Africa and in the Americas, or theories of world literature? To the degree that the politics of refusal seeks to disentangle from the settler colonial policies of imperial and neoliberal nation states, and that it has not found help in post-colonial experience and literature, the pre-colonial and its historically instantiated life forms and life worlds can provide comparative examples of imagining what is possible beyond the limits imposed by the neoliberal nation state. The different historical iterations of the ternary help us to think through the most pressing issues of today and tomorrow, alongside visiting scholars working on historical and contemporary topics in philosophy, anthropology, gender, race, ethnicity, sovereignty. And I invite you to look at our ECT webpage for more information and the rest of the programming for this quarter. Today, we welcome Etienne Anheim, who is Directeur d'études, full professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, the Institute for Social Sciences in Paris. His work focuses on cultural forms and material wealth in Europe in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, especially manuscripts, archives, music and pictorial works, and more generally also in heritage sciences. He has published Clément's Sixth at Work, Reading, Writing, and Preaching in the 14th Century, and also The Work of History, 2018. He has pursued research in the fields of historiography, epistemology of the social and historical sciences, and theory of interdisciplinarity, as well as having worked with scientists on archaeological mineralized textiles and chemistry of cultural heritage. He was editor-in-chief of the very well-known journal Annales from 2011 to 2018. And then in 2018, he took over as head of the University Press of the EHESS. He is also a member of the Scientific Council of the Louvre Museum and heads the research group called anthropologie historique du Long Moyen Âge, or historical anthropology of the Long Middle Ages. But why is he here?
That's a good question.
There's another question. Well, most recently, in the past several years, he has worked on the famous Italian 14th century poet Petrarch at the conceptual tipping point of the pre-colonial and colonial. And so the title of his talk today is The Role of the Renaissance in the Transformation of the Western Political Imaginary, Petrarch's Africa, and Death for the Power. Join me in welcoming Etienne.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Hello, everyone. So I wish to thank not only Zrenka, but the CLA, the ACT program, the Center for Early Global Studies, and thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here. This is my very first time in California, so now I can confirm that the best really exists. In the movies, because when you're European French, like, movies and TV shows. But I have to say that being here for 2 days and after a very rainy walk yesterday in the gardens of Huntington Library, I'm not completely convinced by this sunny state thing. So, very happy to discover the good weather, and very happy to discuss with you, going back to my lecture, this question of the death for the fatherland, beginning not in the Middle Ages, but in the antiquity, with the phrase, my first slide, with the phrase, die for the fatherland, that recalls the words of the Latin poet Horace, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and honorable to die for the fatherland. And its echoes can be heard as far afield as the contemporary military memorials on which it is inscribed, such as the chapel at Sandhurst Military Academy in Great Britain. And at the time of the French Revolution, for example, in a poem, Rouget de Lille, which is the author of the Marseillaise, the French national anthem, had Roland say at Roncesvalles, mourir pour la patrie, c'est le sort le plus beau, le plus digne d'envie. To die for the fatherland is the most beautiful fate, the most worthy of envy. And this Roland brings us back to medieval times, my focus today. And first of all, I would like to note the peculiarity of this expression, to die for the fatherland, is not to die for a cause or to die for an idea, nor it is simply to sacrifice oneself for something bigger than the individual. It certainly includes some of the abstract dimension of these idealized sacrifice, but this abstraction is rooted in a concrete, specialized element, this fatherland, which is not only ideal, but also material. The walls of the city, the soil of the native land, the cemeteries where the dead lie in rest. So to really interrogate this phrase, we have to move beyond the feeling that we are dealing with a timeless adage, a commonplace about sacrifice, whose history would be difficult to trace. So much does it seem to follow the wars of men through time. On the contrary, I'd like to historicize this commonplace based on a reading of Petrarch, the great humanist poet of the 14th century. And just at the end of the
Sorry.
No, I just was, yes, I barely see them, but Petrarch is there. So, historicize this commonplace means both in semantics and its social performativity, because they have shifted over time. Death and fatherland do not have the same meaning across the centuries. ancient warfare is not the same as feudal conflicts or democratic and then industrial warfare, if I can say. And my aim is to think of death for the fatherland as what the philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis called an imaginary institution, whose dissemination produces concrete historical effects. In particular, brutalization, as defined by Georg Mosse to describe the world wars in the European context. I will explore the role of the Renaissance in the construction of this new imaginary of domination, including its post-colonial dimension, based on a reading of Petrarch's great Latin epic, Africa, which recounts the war between Rome and Carthage. And this historical interrogation is combined with a historiographical one. The question I pose is also at the heart of a famous article wrote by Ernst Kantorowicz, Pro Patria Mori in Medieval Political Thought, that was first presented as a lecture to the American Historical Association on December 29, 1949, and published in the American Historical Review in 1951. This article begins at Christmas 1914 in German-occupied Belgium with Cardinal Mercier's speech of resistance. And this is my next text, and I will read it with you. And Cardinal Mercier said, "But if you ask me what I think of the eternal salvation of a brave man who consciously gives his life to defend the honor of his country and to avenge violated justice, I do not hesitate to reply that there is no doubt whatever that Christ crowns military valor, and that death Christianly accepted assures to the soldier the salvation of his soul. The soldier who dies to save his brother, to protect the hearts and the altars of his country, fulfills the highest form of love. We are justified in hoping for them the immortal crown which encircles the foreheads of the elect. For such is the virtue of an act of perfect love, that of itself alone it whips out the whole life of sin. Of a sinner, instantly it makes a saint. And as Kantorowicz observes, in fact, to the ears of the professional medievalists, almost every word of Cardinal Mercier's pastoral letter has the familiar ring of a long-established tradition, medieval. His wide-ranging investigation begins in antiquity, where the commonplace of dying for the fatherland originated in Sparta or Athens, before moving on to Virgil, Cicero, Horace, Petrarch's classical references. But as Kantorowicz reminds us, in antiquity, the fatherland referred to the city-state and its institutions, not to a political territory in the modern sense. And this death that made heroes almost gods promised only fame and remembrance. With Augustine's City of God, the Christianity of the Church Fathers erased these earthly fatherlands for which it was glorious to die in favor of the martyr model, which is fundamentally different. As Kantorowicz remarks, the Christian is a citizen of a city in another world. And yet, in the feudal period, sacrifice only had meaning if it was made for one's lord and not for a territory. So it therefore took several centuries for the idea of dying for the fatherland to take shape again in a very different way from antiquity. From the 12th century onwards, the motif combined the ideal of a crusade with the idea of a kingdom. And the Holy Land was a turning point as people fought and died both for a physical land and for heaven. It then followed the contours of the emerging early modern monarchical states from Philip the Fair onwards. And in this history, Kantorowicz cites jurists, theologians, and poets such as Dante, but humanism is almost absent, as if medieval Christianity were antagonistic to this humanism, which in turn was driven only by a concern to resurrect antiquity and its values. And in this paper, Petrarch is barely mentioned, which is all the more curious given that Kantorowicz affords an important place to the author in his famous essay on the sovereignty of the artist. Yet, Petrarch would have provided much food for thought, precisely in the poem Africa. This work, Africa, dedicated to King Robert of Naples, is written in hexameters on the epic model of the Aeneid. It was begun in 1337, but Petrarch continued to work on it throughout his life, and it was not circulated in its final form until more than 20 years after his death. So it's an unfinished work. The work recounts the victory over Carthage and the beginning of Roman control over North Africa. It centers on the figure of Scipio Africanus, the general of the Roman army, and is permeated by the question of sacrifice for Rome. This theme lies at the heart of Book 1 in particular, and it's interesting to quote the final lines. Scipio looks at the stars. His father and uncle, both of whom have died in the war, show him the source of the Roman fighters in heaven. That the text, Scipio turned his eyes in his desire to see them, that is, these thousands of souls that fill the expanse of the sky. And a huge crowd stood not far away, where the Milky Way, dotted with countless stars, bends toward the motionless big people. He was astonished and asked who these men were, their names and their deeds. And his father remarks that the night is drawing to a close and adds, let it suffice you to know this. These are Roman souls, whose only concern was to defend their fatherland. Most of them came to this sojourn, spilling their blood, rightly preferring to exchange their ephemeral life for eternal life at the price of a bitter sacrifice. So, in fact, I'd like to propose now sort of close reading of these few verses from Africa, inserting them into the long history of death for the fathers. Through these lines, I will ask how Petrarch was an actor in and a witness to the transformation of this motif at the end of the Middle Ages, and how he participated in the construction of its modern status. To understand him properly, you really have to read Petrarch as a Christian and medieval author, especially when he seeks to pastiche antiquity. And we have to consider Africa as a medieval epic, sort of medieval peplum. Book 1 borrows from both Cicero and medieval ghosts, although Petrarch's Scipio falls asleep just as he does in Cicero's account of the dream. The appearance of his father is spectral, and It is hard not to be reminded of Christ's quotation. From the silent sky, a great shadow descended, and through the clouds suddenly appeared the face in his father, showing his beloved son, his heart, his side, and his chest pierced by many blows. In particular, I'd like to identify three essential shifts in Africa. Shifts mean here enlargement and extensions that modify the imaginary of death for the father in the context of the 14th century Christian society and make it anything but a simple resurrection of the ancient conception. The third shift concerns the temporality of this death for the father, which undergoes an initial process of extension. By choosing to write about Republican Rome, Petrarch brings the classical world into the medieval imaginary to produce what will come to be known as the Renaissance. But he also modifies the past in the opposite direction. He appropriates the Roman past that became the prerogative of European Christian society at the end of the Middle Ages, and which via this appropriation came to resemble it in many ways. Book 7 shows a veritable process of the transformation of the past to the benefits of the Romans. God's omnipotence is on the side of Italy and Rome. And win or die, says Scipio to the Roman soldier, since the last charge is a path leading to either Rome or the gods. And these warlike and chivalric metaphors, so characteristic of medieval Christianity, are at work in shape Petrarch's description of the ancient world. Scipio's father displays his wounds as a Christ-like apparition, I say. But Christ bears wounds that resemble those received in battle. Works in both ways. And they produced what might be called a colonization of the past, a movement by which historical ancient Rome retrospectively becomes the roots of early modern Europe. And here, this also doubles as a Christianization of the past. Another ongoing process beginning in late antiquity, the commentary on Scipio's dream from as far back as Racine or even Sienkiewicz, Bovadis, which inspired the film. But even more remarkably, Petrarch's death for the fatherland is not just a rewriting of ancient death. It is also a temporal colonization of the future, since this death now heralds not just fame and glory, but salvation and eternal life. In other words, it is now inscribed in a Christian eschatology. And maybe the next. No, I was the previous one. I'm sorry. My quotation of this inscription in Christian eschatology. By these wounds, wholly and rightly so. It's a holy wound for Roman general. Wholly and rightly so, since thanks to them, I have returned to my fatherland all that I owed it, since thanks to them, my virtue in battle has opened path to heaven. By staging death for Rome in Book 1 of Africa, Petrarch extends the temporal domain of the motive of death for the fatherland, annexing the Roman past to the 14th century world and anticipating the future of the end of time, of eternal life. In so doing, he profoundly modifies the articulation of temporalities and he reinterprets ancient death in a new sense. A second shift, also in the form of an extension, is spatial. The name Rome now refers to a particular territory, and the fatherland becomes a space rather than just a city or even an idea. The fatherland evoked in Africa is at once a localization, means Rome, a territorialization, Italy, and a potential expansion, the empire to come. And Petrarch plays with time, as we can see at the beginning of Book 2, where he presents a tableau of the geography of the battles and of Roman history that is marked by an anticipated awareness of Rome's imperial future. Once again, medieval Christianity, a powerful instrument of spatialization, the church as building, the cemetery as a resting place of ancestors, the diocese as territory, relayed by the emergent early modern states, seeps into the humanist narrative. In so doing, it makes possible a completely different relationship to the motive of a warrior's death for the fatherland, which becomes death in the name of a territory, itself defended against other warriors from other territories, Rome against Carthage. And this territorial confrontation underpins Petrarch's profoundly spatial description of the Punic War. We are presented with a confrontation between two fatherlands that are almost nations, a mode that the contemporary era has reinvested in European conflicts such as the First World War. But also we have here the confrontation between two civilizations, reinvested in another mode in contemporary times by colonial wars. And this is a huge difference, this shift. Thus, right from the outset, Petrarch said, noble Africa is proclaimed annihilated under arms, fractas ut artis, earning an eternal name for its conquerors. Petrarch sets out his intention to, quote, represent the total destruction of criminal Africans by war and the crushing of their forces. And this very strong formulation, very shocking, seems to anticipate the wars of extermination waged by Europeans in Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which is, of course, broad generalization, but also leads us to reflect on the significance of these looping time frames from a racial and post-colonial perspective. Petrarch's transfer of the medieval perception of space, that of the church, but also the embryonic early modern state to the past of the Punic Wars shows the legitimacy of the death for the fatherland and vision as a territory to be defended. But it goes even further. It is a crucial shift because it reflects the way that Europeans have understood space since Renaissance. The ancient Mediterranean was actually very different. It was a world of city-states, including Rome and Carthage. So it is hard to conceive of this when Rome has become the paradigm of the Western territorial empire, right up to contemporary strategy, as shown, for example, in the Cold War context by Edward Ludwig's 1976 volume, The Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire. This new awareness of space thematized death for the fatherland far from home in a logic essential to founding the imperial and colonial models that emerged from Petrarch's Africa onwards. Scipio and his people can die for Rome in Africa, just as the French did in Algeria, the Italians in Ethiopia, in a paradoxical figure based on an anthropologically Christian universalism, in which it is the invader who is defending their fatherland or even dying for it far from their own territory. And in other words, I mean that the colonial projection of Europeans into the world was accompanied by a new discourse on death for the fatherland. And finally, a third shift takes the form of another extension, this time of a social nature. The ancient death of Jean-Pierre Vernant, Pierre Vidal-Naquet, Nicole Leroux is an individual aristocratic death, like that of the heroes of the Chanson de Roland or of the Quest for the Grail. But in Petrarch's Africa, death takes on a collective dimension. The stars in the constellations at the end of Book 1, representing the souls of thousands of fallen Roman soldiers, are the result of collectivization of death. Collectivization of death, a sort of democratization of the potential to die a warrior, so to speak. This process of collectivization is based on family ties. Kinship is underlined by the relationship between Scipio and his father and uncle, but the history of their family is interwoven with that of the fatherland. Scipio's drive to war is initially described from a personal perspective, and I quote, to appease the sacred ashes, the shadows of his parents, by the cruel blood of slaughter, and wash the shame from, wash the shame from the forehead of Italy. This obsession made the heart of the industrious Scipio beat relentlessly. But it is then generalized because for the Romans in Africa, it is a matter of avenging the death of the father, the brother, and soon of their entire people. The community of those fallen for the fatherland is thus conceived on the model of the medieval kinship, of a real kinship bound up with a spiritual kinship, so prominent in medieval Christian anthropology. This dimension echoes Kantorowicz's observation that love of the fatherland is defined as caritas, that is, as taking the same form as social relations within the church. For Kantorowicz, this explains why we can live and die for it as Christians, a sentiment echoed in the words of Cardinal Mercier during the First World War. In the final analysis, this is why dying for the fatherland can also become a generational act, especially for youth. Scipio evokes a valiant youth dedicated to death that follows me. And here again, we can see the effects of looping temporalities. And it is hard not to think of Italian fascism and its masculinism as we read quotations such as this one from Book 7. Here, born amidst arms, it is Roman youth resisting thanks to the virile strength of Italy that fights. The Roman cohort provides another image of this collective in Book 1. March faster, noble cohorts, death envied by men of honor is on the threshold. you will forever be honored with pious tears and in eternal incense on Roman altars. The motivation of immense glory and fame through death, inherited from the ancient model, is thus profoundly transformed from within by the horizon of eternal life and the salvation of the Christian people. And this, in turn, significantly changes the meaning of death for the fatherland. Petrarch and Africa play a considerable role in this transformation, or at least they offer what we can call a landmark in humanist thought that makes it possible to highlight this threefold extension of the ancient idea of dying for the fatherland. The concept transported into the Christian monarchical and territorialized world of the 14th century extends in temporal reach, space, and in its social signification. And for Cardinal Mercier, a worldly death corresponds to the redemption of sins. Remember, I quote Cardinal Mercier again, for such is the virtue of an act of perfect love, that of itself alone it whips out a whole life of sin. And these words illuminate, in retrospect, a famous line from Petrarch's canzoniere, un bel morire tutta la vita honor. A beautiful death honors all life. In this way, Petrarch, who has sometimes been considered part of Europe's founding myth, in his own right, helped establish a new imaginary institution at the heart of the Western culture at the dawn of the Renaissance. And since the triumph of democratic nation states in the 19th century, this totally renewed concept of death for the fatherland. And this totally renewed concept has structured the relationship to violent death that has been so characteristic of modern Europe and also permeates its literature. And one of the closest and most evocative models in this Petrarchan tradition is Giosuè Carducci. Carducci is the first Italian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1906. And Carducci's relationship with Petrarch is well known. He taught a university course on the author, and he compiled the critical edition of his poems. And Carducci's poetry celebrates the death of the Risorgimento as the descendants of those Roman souls who have joined the stars. It has been said that his work articulates a secular religion for the secular religion of the fatherland through the sacralization of the martyrs of the wars of the 19th century, built on ancient ideals, Horace, revolutionary zeal, and even the thinking of Jules Michelet. But the pivotal role of Petrarch seems hard to ignore. As Laura Fournier puts it, I quote, the cult of the fallen soldiers was ready to become the core of the religion of national ideologies. And there are, of course, many other examples in European literature. France, for example, we need only to think of Maurice Barrès, nationalist far-right author, who in Le Suffrage des Morts or in La Terre et les Morts combines a conception of the community of the living and the dead with an idea of the universal vocation of martial sacrifice. I quote Barrès, to allow the conscience of a country such as France to emerge, individuals must be rooted in the earth and in the dead. Pares, like Carducci, was one of the heirs of the new imaginary that emerged at the end of the Middle Ages. So apparent in Petrarch, but Petrarch is not the same, it's not alone, and just an example. And which has nourished mass death, nationalist confrontation, and Europe's colonial wars. And Kantorowicz concludes his reflection on the motive of death of for the fatherland with fascist Italy, evoking the banner, Chi muore per l'Italia non muore, who dies for Italy does not die. And this banner was displayed on the Duomo in Milan at Christmas 1937 to commemorate the fascists who died in the Spanish Civil War. And it is obviously impossible to overlook the fascist reinvestment of Petrarch's Africa in the context of the invasion of Ethiopia in 1936. And we might also note that Nicola Festa's new critical edition dates from 1926, and Festa was not himself a fascist, but nevertheless, it was he who translated Mussolini's speeches on the Italian colonial empire into Latin. Rereading Petrarch thus sheds new light on this long history, and we must return to our original question. Kantorovic's impasse on the poem Africa. Why Kantorovicz didn't say anything about Petrarch in this paper? No doubt we must first make allowance for chance, or at least circumstances. Humanist ideology, which sees the Christian Middle Ages as totally different from the Renaissance, is undoubtedly another major obstacle to thinking about Petrarch's contribution to the Christian transformation of death for the fatherland and its modern appropriation. But it could also be that Kantorowicz has difficulty identifying Petrarch as a link in this ambivalent construction, because he, Kantorowicz himself, is caught up in it. Indeed, the conclusion of his article shows that Kantorowicz shares this imaginary, but sees its latest development only as a perversion. He quotes, "Some of the recent nationalistic ravings which so terribly distort an originally venerable and lofty idea," for which Kantorowicz also blames the disenchantment of the word that has dissipated ancient ethical values. And Kantorowicz added, "We are about to demand a soldier's death without any reconciling emotional equivalent for the lost life." All of a sudden, Kantorowicz's deep personal involvement erupts into the text, which must also be read in the light of his own trajectory. Although destined to enter the family business as a merchant, Kantorowicz enlisted in 1914, and he served as a soldier for 4 years during the First World War. And it was even thanks to the German army that he was able to pursue his university education to the highest level. So it was thus because Kantorowicz was prepared to die for his fatherland that he was able to fulfill his brilliant intellectual destiny. At first in a Germany whose militarism he shared, before reluctantly fleeing Nazi persecution because he was a Jew, and then went to the United States. And the United States, as Blanche Chelini-Pont has shown, after 1945, became one of the repositories of this idea of martial sacrifice for the fatherland and the community, from Korea to Afghanistan via Vietnam, reviving this messianic, territorial, and imperial dimension that began to emerge in the text of the late Middle Ages. So, just concluding, it is perhaps the involvement of the humanist tradition in this process that Kantorowicz finds so difficult to acknowledge and even to see sort of blind spots. This involvement forced him to question his own position and the nature of the relationship and possible continuity between the humanist ethic and colonialism or fascism. Kantorowicz's omission of Africa is thus perhaps the sign of bad conscience from which we should not be too quick to exclude ourselves. Because just to example, finish, today's French historians often think of ourselves as the heirs of Marc Bloch. Marc Bloch's great historians, a real hero that fought the Nazis and was killed by them. But Marc Bloch, whose only instruction for his funeral was that his 5 military citations from the First World War be read out. Very interesting facts. And I think of Lucien Febvre, his friend of the Anheim, a former officer who faced similar internal struggles and who, in the same post-war conjuncture as Kantorowicz, gave a lecture at the Collège de France entitled Honneur et patrie, une enquête sur le sentiment d'honneur et l'attachement à la patrie, honor and fatherland, an investigation into feelings of honor and attachment to the fatherland. So this is a proof that the questioning began in the concluding lines of Book 1 of Petrarch's Africa, runs not only through our modernity, but also through our academic disciplines themselves. And as the examples of Kantorowicz, Bloch, and Febvre reminds us, the long-term ramification of the experience of war and violence are by no means external to the intellectual traditions of the humanities and continue to echo right up to the present day.
About 10, 15 minutes for questions. I'll open it up. Lele.
Thank you so much. It was really fascinating and very, very interesting. I particularly appreciated the way in which you have shown how Petrarch's interest for the classics corresponds to a Christianization, because usually, the Vulgata is this, like almost philological attempt to revitalize even the Virgilian example. That's not why, you show how, in a way, there is also this very powerful and strong Christianization. You have spoken of colonization, of the classical world.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. And I don't know, just like in Italian we say a caldo, up the spot, just two reactions. One is that I have listened to a paper maybe a month ago on the way in which Livy stages the speech between Hannibal and Scipio before Zama. And in Roman history, that's the beginning of a long debate on the empire and on the problem of the empire, and also in a way,
Yes.
in the way in which war changes within the Roman tradition, and it opens up to this idea of conquest that sort of is not so different from
No,
this.
exactly.
So I thought it was interesting that sense of empire, colonization, or change of war was already present in Roman historiography and sort of begins in a way with Scipio and that. So I don't know, I thought that was already, so I wonder, maybe it's not only a colonization, but it's also picking up something that was
Yes.
already in in Roman history. And the other maybe just brief point that I wanted to make, because like I am more familiar with the vernacular Petrarch, and it's a very different world from the Latin one. And in the vernacular Petrarch, you never have anything that is sort of like mandatory, absolute. Everything is constantly contradicted. And I thought it was very interesting that these dying for faith, which here is replaced in Africa for dying for God, is precisely what is constantly picked up and resists the Christian faith. So I don't know, like I was wondering whether also like whether this, yeah, after all, so the Africa is not finished, but these sort of like constant tensions are also present in the Latin Petrarch, or things are more clear cut?
I think it's very special in the Africa, and this idea is quite strange idea to write a sort of epic in the middle of the 14th century, because Petrarch was really convinced that that was his masterpiece. And that is for us something very funny that exists with a lot of other examples, because, for example, Voltaire was convinced that his theater was the most important things, and nobody never read, even in France, the theater of Voltaire. So Petrarch was writing this piece and convinced that that was the equivalent for him of that made him the equivalent of Virgil or Homer. And in fact, this was a sort of dead end pass. And in the same time, all his work in vernacular and also in Latin, but in the correspondence, was the real place of his creativity. But I think that Africa is interesting in an ideological perspective, and that's why today. So I've got colleagues in classics that are very interested in the new edition of Africa. So I do not have to say that it's not interesting, but it's interesting also from a linguistical point of view. How can we write hexameters in the middle of the 14th century, and why? But if we see the text, we have this very strong perspective and very different of this dialectical perspective of the vernacular work. Everything is every time moving, whereas in this work, Petrarch was a very unit and very strong point of view on the history. And that helps me to come to your first remark, because in fact, you are completely right. The story of the Punic Wars was already completely rewritten by the imperial authors, and it's a sort of very long process, sort of storytelling in the making, because the Punic Wars were wars between two city states, and during the imperial era of the beginning of the imperial era, this fight was completely reshaped in a new way of this imperial ideology. And then at the end of the Middle Ages, and it is interesting that the poem was not dedicated to a friend or to someone in Florence or Venice or Avignon, but to Robert of Naples and to this Mediterranean dynasty, which has a sort of political expansion in the Mediterranean world. So I think they are constantly reshaping this history, and Carducci reshaped it in a completely other way, because for Carducci, what is important is the Risorgimento, but he reused some commonplaces in Petrarch's Africa to describe the Risorgimento. Thank you. I see too.
just as an outsider really, but I was thinking of, Carducci didn't really have a fatherland. I mean, Carducci, Petrarch. And, in fact, he writes in Latin rather than Italian, also seems to contrast him with Dante, who very much had a fatherland, but couldn't really be there. That's one thing. And then another just quick comment. I come from ancient history and the very beginning, in fact, of urbanization. And one thing that's interesting is that in the Mesopotamian languages, the Sumerian, Assyrian, Babylonian, there is no word for fatherland, but the way you describe a citizen is to say son of the city name. So it's kind of a indirect way of referring to a fatherland.
Oh, thank you. I didn't know that, but I think this transformation is very important from the word of city-states to a word of territory monarchies, and we have to understand that yes, fatherland or patria is not the same meaning because of what you say, and that's right that Petrarch didn't have really a fatherland, but maybe that's why he made such an effort to create the myth of a new Italy, because I think that his position in Avignon first and then but never in Florence, and he was never a Florentine citizen, but it was just an imagination. Was the occasion to build something new in regard of the Italian unity. Famous, the famous poem in the Canzoniere in Italia. Yeah.
Thank you very much again for your elegant lecture. My question is just if you could say something more, because you just presented, it's not the topic, but you just said that Africa was the poem Petrarca thought relied upon for his fate. I just focusing on the Petrarca Latinus. I wonder whether you could also discuss some possible counter arguments. Francesco Flora, in a famous argument, he said that this was a big imposture. It's like someone who get tenure with a book in print, but the manuscript of which was never submitted to the publisher. And this is what's happening. The Barbatova Sulmona, Boccaccio triangulation, Petrarch is extremely elusive there. And given, you know very well, his insincerity, his brilliant. So how much this non-publication is not just a matter of fact, was working on it, he died, but there is something structural in it. And then, of course, cast a different light also on the use of it as an expression of Petrarch's mind.
Yeah, that's very interesting because first we have to think that, in fact, it's a project made during his youth, because the first version is, so Petrarch was born in 04, and the first version of the Africa was written in 37, and then he died in 74. So, but so was something, as you said, and I like your comparison with the tenure and the book never submitted, but he never let the book apart, and he went on writing and rewriting the hexameters. So there is something quite strange, and it's not only for the Africa, because in fact Petrarch kept a lot of his works with him until the end. The Canzoniere, the Canzoniere is not. We are not sure that the Canzoniere is the final version, because the same thing. He didn't release it. Maybe one or two poems with friends. So it's this strange manner to keep his works until the end, as if there was ever the possibility to do something better or do something new. And so with the Africa, we get this this hesitation between two interpretation. But I really think he was convinced by the idea to deliver great master work with the African, this idea to be an equivalent to the great Roman poets. Yeah, please.
Yes, we will allow.
Many thanks for your paper, which is a wonderful paper. And it sort of sent me back to 50 years ago in Australia seminar discussing precisely questions of patria mori, because Australia was very influenced by Kantorowicz. But I wonder whether the shifts that you identified in Petrarch are not really prompted by the real relationship between France and the papacy at the beginning of the 14th century, when people like William of Nogaret would say pro patria mori, and that is also talks about a territorial state against an old concept of Rome. So I wonder what is the relationship between the actual events of the early 14th century and Petrarch was writing just a little bit afterwards in the port of Avignon, and who knows in this world between France and Italy.
No, I agree with you, and that's why I quoted very quickly Philippe the Fair and the construction of the new monarchical state, because I think that something is changing at the very beginning of the 14th century, as you said, that is the construction of a new conception of the political power linked to a territory, and something that was secularized, say that, secularized by Philip the Fair and taken from church. For example, diocese in the 13th century was beginning to be conceived as a territory, which is something quite new in the church tradition. And after Philip the Fair and after this big conflict with the papacy, it was a new conscience in Europe, in France, but also in England, and then in Spain overall, that the new state is a territorial one, and not only a power on people, but also a power on a land with borders. And Petrarch is the son of this story in a certain way, and I think you're right.
This concludes the public part of today's seminar. Thank you, Etienne, very much. Thank you. So we are going to take a short break.